They handed me divorce papers on my 50th birthday, in a room full of my own friends, with the lights still dim from the candles I'd just blown out. My wife stood beside her lawyer boyfriend, his hand resting on the small of her back like he owned the room, like he owned her, like he owned me. She smiled when she said I'd leave with nothing but the clothes on my back. 40 people laughed. Not one of them knew that 6 hours earlier, at 8:12 that morning, the man standing beside her had already lost everything he thought he had. My name is Richard Voss. I am 50 years old, and this is the night my wife tried to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved, believing she held every card in the deck. What she didn't know was that she was holding a deck I had quietly reshuffled months before she ever thought to deal. To understand how we got to that ballroom, you have to go back to the beginning, because I need you to know I didn't marry a cruel woman. I married someone I believed in completely, and that belief is what made everything that came after so much harder to accept. I met Diane Whitfield in the autumn of 1999 at a hardware trade show in Cleveland, of all places. She was working the booth for a lighting fixtures company, and I was there representing my father's small architectural millwork business, a company that had been 3 employees and a leaking warehouse roof when he handed it to me 2 years earlier. Diane had a laugh that carried across a convention floor, and eyes that made you feel like you were the only interesting person she'd spoken to all day. I found a reason to walk past her booth 4 times before I worked up the nerve to ask her to dinner. She said yes, and for the next 22 years I built my life around that yes. We married in 2001 in a small ceremony behind her parents' house in Akron. String lights hung between 2 oak trees, her father crying openly during the vows, which surprised everyone because he was not a man given to tears. I remember thinking, standing there, that I had found the one person who would always be in my corner, no matter what. For the first several years, Diane worked alongside me building what would eventually become Voss Architectural Millwork into something real. She answered phones. She kept the books before we could afford a bookkeeper. She drove 2 hours each way to a trade show in Pittsburgh with me once, both of us sleeping in the truck because we couldn't justify the cost of a motel room. I want to be honest about this part because it matters for everything that comes later. Diane was not a passenger in those early years. She was a partner in every sense except the legal one. And for a long time, that distinction never seemed to matter to either of us. It mattered enormously to me why the company had been structured the way it was, but I'll get to that. What I want you to understand first is that we built something real together. Something I was proud of, something I thought would carry us both into old age. I never imagined that the woman who slept in that truck beside me in Pittsburgh would one day stand in a rented ballroom and tell our friends I would leave with nothing. But she did. And by the time she said it, I had already known for 4 months exactly who she had become. Here's the part most people get wrong when they hear this story secondhand. They assume I structured the company to protect myself from Diane specifically, that I somehow saw this coming decades in advance. That isn't what happened, and I think the truth is more interesting than the assumption. When my father handed me Voss Architectural Millwork in 1997, he did something unusual for a man who ran his business on handshakes and a Rolodex. He insisted, over my objections, that the company remain a sole proprietorship registered entirely in my name, with no partners, no shared equity, nothing that could be divided or diluted. I asked him why, half joking, if he didn't trust me to run it. He didn't laugh. He sat me down in the same cramped office where he'd built the business from nothing, and he told me about his own brother, my Uncle Walt, who I'd never met, because Walt had walked away from their father's original hardware store in 1968 after a business partnership dissolved into a decade of litigation that bankrupted both men and destroyed the family for 2 generations. A business needs one name on the door, my father said. Not because you don't trust the people you love, because love and ownership are two different kinds of promises, and mixing them up is how families get destroyed. I thought he was being paranoid. I signed the paperwork exactly as he asked, because I respected him too much to argue further. And then I mostly forgot about it, the way you forget about an insurance policy you hope you'll never need. For the next 2 decades, that distinction simply didn't come up. Diane worked in the business. She had opinions about everything from our supplier contracts to the paint colors in our showroom, and I valued every one of them. When we hired our first full accountant in 2009, Diane sat in on every meeting. When we expanded into custom staircase work in 2014, doubling our revenue inside 3 years, it was Diane who negotiated our lease on the second warehouse. Diane who charmed our first major commercial client into a 5-year contract over a 2-hour lunch I wasn't even present for. She called it our company in every conversation, at every dinner party, in every conversation with her sisters back in Akron, and I never once corrected her. Why would I? In every way that mattered to me, it was ours. The paperwork was just paperwork. I understand now that this was my first real mistake. Not the structure itself, but the silence around it. I let Diane build 20 years of identity around a word, ours, that had no legal weight behind it, and I never told her otherwise because it never occurred to me that the distinction would ever need defending. You don't rehearse for a betrayal you can't imagine. You just live inside a marriage you trust, and you let the years pile up like sediment until one day something shifts underneath, and you realize the ground was never quite what it was. The cracks started small enough that I explained each one away individually, the same way you might explain away a single strange noise in an old house before you eventually have to admit the whole foundation is settling. It started with Marcus Aid. We hired Marcus in early 2023 after a dispute with a supplier in Grand Rapids threatened to unravel a contract worth almost $400,000. Our longtime attorney had retired the year before, and a colleague recommended Marcus, a contracts litigator with a sharp reputation and an office downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. He was 38, precise in his language, the kind of lawyer who made you feel reassured simply by how carefully he chose his words. He resolved the supplier dispute in 6 weeks, saving us most of the contract value, and I was genuinely grateful. I shook his hand and told him he'd be our first call for anything legal going forward. I meant it as a compliment. I had no idea I was inviting a wolf to keep a standing appointment in my house. Marcus became our general counsel on retainer by the summer of 2023, which meant increasingly regular meetings, increasingly regular phone calls, and increasingly meetings that Diane attended without me because she said she wanted to handle the boring stuff so I could focus on production. I was relieved, honestly. I'd never enjoyed the legal side of the business, and Diane seemed energized by it in a way that reminded me of the early years, the two of us in that truck outside Pittsburgh, hungry and building something. What I didn't notice, or didn't let myself notice, was the specific shape her energy was taking. She started using phrases she'd never used before: asset protection, equity restructuring, succession planning. Phrases that belonged in a boardroom, not in our kitchen at 11 at night. She'd bring up, almost casually, over dinner, whether we'd ever considered converting the business structure for tax efficiency, whether it might make sense to formally add her name to the ownership documents, in case anything ever happened to me. Framed always as prudence, always as love, always as the kind of thing a devoted wife thinks about so her husband doesn't have to. I told her I'd look into it. I meant to. I kept meaning to for the better part of a year. The way you mean to get around to updating a will or reading the fine print on an insurance renewal. I trusted her completely. which is precisely why I never asked myself the one question that would have changed everything much sooner. Why was my wife suddenly so interested in paperwork that had never interested her in 20 years? And why did every conversation about it happen to circle back eventually to something Marcus had mentioned? The night everything cracked open for me wasn't dramatic. That's the part I still find strange when I tell this story. There was no slammed door, no screaming match, no moment where I caught them together in some obvious cinematic way. It was a Tuesday in February, and I was looking for the stapler. Diane had left her laptop open on the kitchen island while she ran out to pick up dry cleaning, which she almost never did, because she was meticulous about closing everything down, a habit left over from years of worrying about client confidentiality. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be completely honest about that, because I've turned this moment over in my mind 100 times since, and I still believe it. I was looking for the stapler in the drawer beneath where her laptop sat, and the screen lit up when I bumped the counter. And there, sitting open in her email, was a message from Marcus Aid with the subject line, Draft, Operating Agreement, Voss Architectural Millwork, LLC. I stood there for a long moment before I let myself open it. I think some part of me already knew, in the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually changes color, some pressure shift in the air that your body registers before your mind catches up. I opened it anyway. It was a full draft operating agreement, professionally formatted, converting the company from a sole proprietorship into an LLC with two members, Richard Voss and Diane Voss, splitting ownership 60-40 in my favor on paper, which I'm sure was meant to look generous, meant to look reasonable, meant to look like exactly the kind of prudent restructuring Diane had been gently suggesting over dinner for the better part of a year. Below it was Marcus's note. Diane, this should hold up even if he pushes back initially. Once it's signed, doesn't matter what percentage is on paper. You'll have a legal claim to the business regardless of what happens between you two. That's really the whole point. Let's talk Thursday about timing. Sooner is better before he gets suspicious of anything. I read that sentence 4 times. Regardless of what happens between you two. I sat down at my own kitchen island, in the house I had paid for with the company my father built, and I felt something very specific happen inside my chest. Something I can only describe as a door quietly closing on 22 years of a version of my life that had already, unbeknownst to me, ended some time before that Tuesday. I did not feel rage, not yet. What I felt first was a kind of vertigo, the sensation of realizing that the ground I'd been standing on had actually been rearranged beneath me for months, maybe longer, while I'd gone on believing I understood exactly where I stood. I closed the laptop exactly the way I'd found it. I put the stapler back in the drawer, empty-handed, because I'd forgotten entirely what I'd come into the kitchen for. And I sat with that email for 3 days before I told a single living soul, turning it over from every possible angle, trying to find an innocent explanation, the way you always try first. Because the alternative asks too much of you all at once. I found no innocent explanation. What I found instead, over those 3 days, was a second email, then a third, buried further back in a folder Diane had labeled, with what I can only assume she thought was clever discretion, homeowners insurance. Inside that folder were 7 months of correspondence with Marcus that had nothing to do with insurance, and everything to do with 2 things happening in parallel. A legal strategy to secure Diane a formal ownership stake in my father's company before I got suspicious, and a relationship that had stopped being professional sometime around the previous spring, documented in the kind of casual, intimate shorthand that leaves no real room for interpretation. Dinner reservations under his name, a hotel in Columbus for what was supposedly a legal conference Diane had attended alone. A message from Marcus that read simply, "Can't stop thinking about last night. You deserve so much more than you're settling for. I sat at my own kitchen table and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its totality, that I was looking at two betrayals braided together so tightly they'd become a single rope, and that rope had been quietly wrapping itself around my company and my marriage for the better part of a year, while I went to work every day trusting the woman who slept beside me every night. I did not confront her. I want to explain why, because I think people expect a different reaction, and I understand that expectation. Confronting her that week would have felt good for exactly as long as the conversation lasted, and then it would have handed her something enormously valuable. Time. Time to get ahead of it. Time to consult Marcus on how to spin it. Time to decide which version of the story she'd tell first, to whichever friends and family members she needed on her side. I had learned enough about Diane in 22 years of marriage to know that when she felt cornered, she moved fast, and she moved strategically. I did not intend to give her that advantage. Instead, I called an old college friend, Priya Nair, who had left our hometown 20 years earlier to build a career as a corporate attorney in Chicago, specializing, as it happened, in exactly the kind of small business ownership disputes I now realized I might be walking into. I drove 3 hours to meet her in person rather than discuss any of it over the phone. I remember sitting across from her in a coffee shop near her office, sliding my father's original incorporation documents across the table, along with printouts of the emails, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. Priya read everything twice before she looked up at me. "Richard," she said, "I want to be very clear with you about what I'm reading here. Your father structured this company as airtight as any sole proprietorship I've seen. There is no operating agreement in existence. There is no signed document granting Diane any ownership stake. Whatever draft they've prepared means nothing unless you sign it, and even discussing it doesn't create any legal obligation on your part." She paused. "What concerns me more is the second thing you're showing me. Depending on how Marcus is licensed and what jurisdiction he's practicing in, there's a real question here about whether he's representing your company's interests, your wife's interests, or his own, all at the same time without disclosing the conflict to you. That's not just an ethical gray area. Depending on the specifics, that could be a serious violation." I asked her what that meant, practically. She leaned back. "It means, if you wanted to, this stops being just a marriage problem. It becomes a professional one for him. And professional problems for lawyers tend to move a lot faster and a lot more permanently than marriage problems." I didn't answer right away. I sat there in that coffee shop 3 hours from home, and I thought about my father telling me, 26 years earlier, that love and ownership were two different kinds of promises. I thought about how right he'd been, and how much it had cost me to finally understand it. And somewhere in that quiet, I stopped feeling like a man who'd been blindsided, and started feeling like a man who finally, after a year of not asking the right questions, knew exactly what to do next. The birthday party had been planned for 3 months before I found that email. Diane's idea entirely, hatched back in November, long before either of us knew a single Tuesday in February would split my life into a before and an after. A rented event space downtown, the same venue we'd used for our 20th anniversary. 40 guests. A live jazz trio she'd booked without asking me, because she said 50 deserved something bigger than our usual dinner at the house. I remember watching the invitations go out in early January, still 3 weeks from the night I'd stand in my own kitchen with a stapler I never found, and thinking there was something slightly performative about the scale of it, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. I understand now. She wasn't planning a birthday party. She was planning a stage. And she'd started building it while I still believed we were building something else entirely. I found out how, exactly, 3 weeks before the event, from Priya, who had quietly reached out to a contact at Marcus's firm to ask a few careful, deniable questions about how conflicts of interest were typically handled there. What came back wasn't what either of us expected. Marcus's firm had strict, well-documented policies prohibiting attorneys from representing clients in matters where they had an undisclosed personal relationship with one of the parties, a policy that existed specifically because the firm had been burned by exactly this kind of situation once before, years earlier, in a costly malpractice settlement that still got mentioned in hushed tones around the office, according to Priya's contact. Marcus had not disclosed his relationship with Diane. He had actively concealed it, filing his hours on the Voss architectural millwork matter under a colleague's supervision code to avoid raising questions about why a junior partner was spending so much personal time on a small millwork company's ownership restructuring. Priya explained it to me plainly, her voice flat and lawyerly over the phone, the kind of calm that told me she'd delivered worse news to other clients before and knew exactly how to pace it. This isn't a gray area, Richard. This is a fireable offense. And depending on how the firm's malpractice carrier views it, it could be career-ending. All it takes is someone bringing it to their attention with documentation.
I sat with that for 4 days before deciding what to do with it.
I want to be honest that there was a version of me in those 4 days that wanted to burn everything down immediately. Wanted Marcus gone by the end of the week. Wanted Diane to feel the floor drop out from under her the moment I knew how. I'd lie awake replaying that sentence from his email, regardless of what happens between you two, until the words lost their shape and became just sound, just static,
The way any sentence does if you turn it over enough times in the dark.
But I had learned something from watching Diane operate for the better part of a year. Something my father had tried to teach me decades earlier without my fully understanding it. The people who move first, out of anger, usually lose the advantage of timing. I decided to wait. Not out of mercy, out of strategy. I compiled everything Priya's contact had confirmed, along with the emails I'd found, into a formal, anonymous complaint to Marcus's firm's ethics compliance office, timed deliberately to land the Monday before my birthday party. I wanted it processed, reviewed, and acted upon before the party itself, not after, because I needed to walk into that ballroom already knowing exactly what I was dealing with. I sent it on a Thursday. I did not have to wait long. On the Monday morning of my birthday, at 8:12 a.m., Marcus Ade was called into a meeting with the firm's managing partner and general counsel. By 9:40, he'd been terminated, his firm email deactivated, his access badge dead, security walking him out of a building he'd entered as a rising partner just 2 hours earlier. The stated reason, according to the internal memo Priya's contact eventually shared with her, cited undisclosed conflicts of interest and misrepresentation of billable work, language careful enough to survive any future lawsuit, damning enough that everyone in that building understood exactly what it meant. I found out at approximately 11:15 that morning, sitting in my truck outside the lumber supplier, reading a 2-line text from Priya. Confirmed, he's out. Effective immediately. I sat there a long moment, engine running, the radio playing something I don't remember, and felt an odd, quiet stillness settle over me. Not triumph, but the particular relief of a man who's spent months carrying something heavy and has finally set it down in exactly the right place. I went home that evening and got dressed for my own birthday party, knowing something Diane did not yet know, and knowing she was about to attempt something in that ballroom that she believed would end with me humiliated and powerless. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, straightening my collar, and thought about my father, who had died 4 years earlier, and never got to meet Marcus, never got to see any of this unfold, but who I understood now, with total clarity, more completely than I ever had while he was alive. It happened after dessert, after the cake had been cut, After my sister's slideshow had faded to a final photo of my father and me standing in front of the original warehouse in 1997, both of us younger and unaware of everything still ahead of us. The room had softened into that particular late-evening warmth where wine glasses are half empty and conversations have grown looser. When Diane stood up, tapping her fork against her glass with a sound that cut cleanly through the jazz trio's last number, "I want to say something," she announced. And the room quieted the way rooms do when someone signals they have an announcement rather than a toast. I watched her scan the doorway one more time, quickly, almost involuntarily, before something in her face resolved into a decision. Whatever she'd planned had involved Marcus standing beside her. He wasn't there. I would learn later from Priya's contact that Diane had called his cell phone 11 times between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock that evening without a single answer, that she had texted him twice asking where he was, growing increasingly frantic in tone, and that Marcus, humiliated and reeling from his own mourning, had simply gone dark, unwilling or unable to face what was coming, leaving Diane to walk into that ballroom alone with a plan that had been built for two people. She didn't know that yet, not consciously, but she'd clearly decided the show had to go on regardless. "Richard," she said, turning to look directly at me. 22 years is a long time, and I think it's time we were both honest about where things actually stand. I set down my wine glass. I remember the specific weight of it in my hand, the condensation on the glass, the way the candlelight refracted through it. I said nothing. I had learned, over the previous 6 weeks, the particular power of simply waiting. "I filed for divorce," Diane said, and reached into her clutch, producing a folded set of papers that she'd clearly been carrying all evening, waiting for the right theatrical moment. "I wanted you to hear it here, tonight, in front of everyone who matters to us. Because I think you deserve to understand, publicly, exactly what kind of man you've actually been for the last several years." A ripple moved through the room, 40 people shifting in their seats, my sister's hand flying to her mouth, Diane's mother going very still and very pale in a way that told me instantly she had not been informed of this plan either. I glanced at her father. He was staring at his plate. "I've been carrying this marriage," Diane continued, her voice rising slightly, taking on the cadence of something rehearsed, something she'd practiced in a mirror or with someone else's help. "I built this company alongside you, Richard, every bit as much as you did, and I have spent years being treated like an employee in my own home. I deserve better than that. I've decided I'm done pretending otherwise." She held the papers out toward me across the table, and I understood, watching her hand tremble almost imperceptibly, that some part of her had expected me to reach for them in shock, to stammer, to beg, to give her exactly the reaction that would justify everything she'd planned to say next. "You'll be served formally next week," she said. "But I wanted to tell you myself tonight, because I think everyone here should understand that this company was never just yours. It's ours. It's always been ours. And when this is finished, Richard, you're going to walk away from this marriage with nothing but the clothes on your back. Because that's exactly what you deserve." Someone at the far table laughed, a short, uncomfortable bark of a sound, quickly swallowed, followed by 2 or 3 other nervous laughs rippling outward the way discomfort does in a room that doesn't know where else to put itself. I don't think anyone there actually found it funny. I think they simply didn't know what else to do with the silence, and Diane's tone had left no room for anyone to ask a clarifying question. I looked at her for a long moment. I looked at the room, at my sister's stricken face, at Diane's father still staring at his plate, at the empty chair beside Diane where Marcus was supposed to be standing, delivering, I imagine, some carefully worded legal reinforcement of everything she'd just said. I thought about my father, 26 years earlier, telling me that love and ownership were 2 different kinds of promises. I thought about the email I'd found in February.
Marcus's careful phrase, regardless of what happens between you two. I thought about the two-line text I'd received in my truck that morning. Confirmed, he's out. Effective immediately.
And then I did something that I think unsettled Diane far more than anger would have. I smiled. "Thank you for telling me," I said, quietly enough that the room had to lean in slightly to hear it. In front of everyone. Diane blinked. Whatever reaction she'd rehearsed for, this clearly wasn't it. "I do want to correct one thing, though," I continued, still holding her gaze, still perfectly calm. "Since you brought up the company in front of all our friends, it was never ours, Diane. It's mine. It's been mine since 1997. Structured that way specifically, with no partnership, no shared ownership. Exactly the way my father set it up before he died. There's no operating agreement. There's no shared equity. There never has been." I paused. "I know, because I've seen the draft you and Marcus prepared. February 3rd. I found it on your laptop while I was looking for a stapler." The room had gone completely, utterly silent now. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears. "And I imagine," I said, "you've been trying to reach him tonight, since he's not standing here beside you the way I assume you both planned. I should probably tell you why he isn't answering. I let that sit for exactly as long as I needed to. He was fired this morning, 8:12 a.m., escorted out of his firm by security by 9:40, for concealing an undisclosed relationship with a client's spouse, while representing that client in a matter directly involving her marital assets. I imagine his phone has been somewhat occupied today with slightly more pressing concerns than answering yours." Diane's face went through 3 distinct changes in the space of about 4 seconds. Confusion, then disbelief, then something collapsing behind her eyes that I can only describe as the specific horror of watching a plan you built your entire self-image around dissolve in real time, in public, in front of every person whose opinion of you has ever mattered. "That's not," she started. "You're lying, Richard. You're just trying to—" "Call him," I said gently. "Go ahead. Right now, in front of everyone, the same way you've asked me to stand here in front of everyone. Call him and ask him how his day went." She didn't move. Her hand, still holding the divorce papers, had begun to shake in earnest now. Not the theatrical tremble from a few minutes earlier, but something involuntary, something real. "Everyone laughed a minute ago," I said. "I want you to understand I did not say this cruelly. I said it almost sadly. Because some part of me, even then, still grieved the woman who had slept beside me in that truck outside Pittsburgh 22 years earlier. I think it might be a good moment to sit back down." She did not sit down. She stood there, papers trembling in her hand, in a room full of people who had 30 seconds earlier laughed along with her, and who were now looking at her with an expression I recognized immediately, because I had worn something close to it myself for the better part of a year. It was the particular look of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about a person, all at once, in real time. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time, though I've since learned from people who were there that it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Time does strange things in rooms like that. It stretches and compresses depending on where you're sitting, and I imagine the 15 seconds felt entirely different to me than they did to Diane, standing there with divorce papers going soft and damp in her trembling hand. It was my sister Karen who finally broke the silence. Not out of cruelty, I don't think, but because someone in that room needed to say something ordinary, needed to put a human-sized frame around what had just happened before it swallowed the whole evening. "Diane," she said quietly, half rising from her chair. "Maybe we should step outside for a minute." Diane didn't look at her. She was still looking at me, and I watched something in her expression shift again, the horror giving way briefly to something sharper, something closer to fury, the particular fury of a person who has just watched a carefully built structure collapse in front of an audience and has not yet decided whether to keep fighting or start running. "You went through my email," she said, and her voice had lost the rehearsed cadence entirely now, had become something raw and unpracticed. "You had no right to do that. I wasn't looking for anything," I said. And I meant it exactly as much as I'd meant it every time I'd told myself the same thing over the previous 6 weeks. "I was looking for a stapler. What I found wasn't something I went looking for, Diane. It was something you left open on the counter."
"That's not—"
She stopped herself, glancing around the room, seeming to register, perhaps for the first time since she'd stood up, that 40 people were watching this unfold in real time, that whatever she said next would live in the memory of every person at that table for years, the way certain sentences do, the way my father's sentence about love and ownership had lived in mine for 26 years. I could see her trying to calculate some way out, some version of the evening that ended with her retaining even a fraction of the narrative she'd walked in with. There wasn't one. I'd made sure of that. Her father stood up then, an older man named Gerald who had always been quiet at family gatherings, content to let Diane's mother do the talking. And I remember being surprised by how steady his voice was when he finally spoke. "Diane," he said, "sit down." Not "sit down, please," not gently, just a flat statement of fact. The kind of tone a parent uses when a child has done something that can't be undone with charm. She looked at him, and for just a moment I saw the 22-year-old version of her, the one I'd married, the one who used to get nervous before meeting new clients and would grip my hand under restaurant tables until the first few minutes passed. That version of her looked, for one brief second, like she might actually sit down. She didn't. Instead, she turned and walked out of the ballroom quickly, the green dress I'd always loved catching the low candlelight as she moved. The divorce papers still crumpled in her fist, and the heavy door swung shut behind her, with a sound that seemed, in that silence, unreasonably loud. I sat back down. I remember the specific sensation of my legs feeling strange beneath me. Not weak, exactly, but distant. The way a limb feels after you've been sitting on it wrong for too long. Hal, my business partner, leaned over from 2 seats away and put a hand briefly on my shoulder, saying nothing, which I appreciated more than any words he could have chosen. The jazz trio, to their credit, had stopped playing entirely somewhere in the middle of Diane's speech, and now the leader, an older man named Curtis, who'd played our anniversary party years earlier, caught my eye from across the room with an expression that asked, silently, whether he should start again. I nodded once, and he counted the band back in, something slow and low, and the room exhaled collectively into the relief of having something else to listen to besides the sound of its own shock. Karen came and sat beside me a few minutes later, her hand finding mine under the table, the way it used to when we were kids and our parents fought in the next room. "Are you okay?" she asked, quietly enough that only I could hear it. "I don't know yet," I told her honestly, because it was the truest thing I could have said. "I think I will be. I'm not there yet." "How long have you known?" "Since February." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing that, the math of it. The 5 months I'd carried this alone before anyone else in the family had any idea. "You didn't tell me," she said, and there wasn't accusation in it, just a kind of sad wonder. "I didn't want to give it anywhere to go," I said. "Not until I knew exactly what I was dealing with." Diane's mother, Eleanor, came over not long after that, her eyes red, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as she perched on the edge of the chair Diane had vacated. "I want you to know," she said. "Neither of us had any idea she was planning this. Gerald and I would never have—" She stopped, pressing a napkin briefly to the corner of her eye. "I'm so sorry, Richard."
I don't know what's happened to her these last few years.
I didn't have an answer for that. Not one I was willing to give voice to in that room, at least. Privately, I suspected the honest answer had less to do with what had happened to Diane, and more to do with what had always been there. Some capacity for reinvention and self-justification that the right pressure, the right opportunity, the right man with an office overlooking the river had simply given room to surface. But I said only, "I know, Eleanor. Thank you." The party ended earlier than planned, guests drifting out in twos and threes with the particular gentleness people extend to a man who's just had his marriage detonated in front of them. Hands on my shoulder, murmured offers of anything you need, just call. Quiet promises that I understood would mostly evaporate by morning the way such promises usually do. Though a few of them, I had learned in the months ahead, turned out to be entirely genuine. I drove home alone that night, the truck radio off, the roads nearly empty. And I found myself thinking not about Diane, not even about Marcus, but about my father, sitting me down in that cramped office in 1997, telling me a story about a brother I never met. I understood, driving home through the dark with the windows cracked and the cold air moving through the cab, that he hadn't been protecting the company from some imagined future threat. He'd been trying to give me a kind of clarity that takes most people decades to earn on their own. The clarity of knowing exactly where love ends and ownership begins. So that when the day came, if it ever came, I wouldn't have to learn it the way his own family had, in litigation and ruin and 2 generations of silence. I'd learned it instead in a kitchen, over a stapler, on a Tuesday in February. I supposed that was its own kind of mercy. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, disjointed rhythm. The ordinary mechanics of a marriage ending, running alongside the ordinary mechanics of a business that still needed running. Orders still needed filling. Crews still needed managing. And I found myself grateful, more than I expected to be, for the sheer physical demand of the work. There is a particular kind of relief in spending a Tuesday morning arguing with a supplier about a shipment of white oak, instead of sitting alone in a house that had, almost overnight, become too quiet in a way I hadn't anticipated. Diane did not come home that night, or the next. She stayed, I learned later, at her sister's place 2 towns over, and for the better part of a week, I heard nothing directly from her at all, only through the thin, unreliable channel of mutual acquaintances, the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. What I did hear, eventually, came from Priya, who called me on a Thursday with an update delivered in the careful, measured tone she used for anything that mattered.
She's retained a lawyer, Priya told me. Someone out of Toledo, not local, which tells me she's trying to keep this quiet, or at least keep it away from anyone who knows Marcus. But Richard, I want to be honest with you. Whatever she thought she had walking into that filing, she doesn't have it now. There's no operating agreement. There's no shared ownership. Everything she said at that party was a story she needed to be true, not something that was ever actually true.
Her attorney is going to figure that out within the first phone call, if he hasn't already. What does that mean for the divorce itself? It means the business isn't on the table the way she wanted it to be, Priya said. It means whatever settlement comes out of this is going to look a great deal more like a standard division of marital assets accumulated during the marriage, and a great deal less like the 50-50 seizure of a company she has no legal claim to. It's still going to be a negotiation, Richard. I won't pretend it won't be. But you're not walking into that negotiation the way she wanted you to be walking into it. You're walking in from a position of actual ground to stand on. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, turning it over the way I'd turned over so many things that year. And I remember feeling, for the first time since February, something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. A loosening somewhere behind my sternum that I hadn't realized had been tightened for months. I heard about Marcus only once more, secondhand, through a colleague of Priya's who mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd left the state entirely, that his name had come up briefly in a local legal newsletter under a short item about attorney discipline, and that he was reportedly working now for a much smaller firm 2 states over, the kind of firm that takes on lawyers whose reputations have been quietly, permanently dented in ways that never show up on a resume, but that everyone in the industry somehow knows about anyway. I felt, hearing this, less satisfaction than I expected to. Mostly, I felt the particular flatness of closing a door on a chapter that had cost me more than it deserved to. A man who had, in the end, mattered far less to the story than he believed he did while he was living inside it. Diane and I finalized the divorce 11 months later, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner, with lawyers on both sides speaking in the flattened procedural language that turns 22 years of a life into a series of line items. She got the house, which I didn't fight for, because I found I didn't want it. Didn't want to keep sleeping in a bedroom that had become, in my memory, mostly the room where I'd learned things about my marriage I'd rather not have learned. She got half the value of our joint savings, which was fair, and which I never disputed. She did not get 1 square foot of Voss architectural millwork. Not $1 of its valuation, not 1 line in any document acknowledging any ownership stake whatsoever, because there had never been one to give her. Only a draft that lived in a folder labeled homeowner's insurance, and a plan that had required a man who never showed up to a party he'd helped plan to destroy. I saw her once more after that, by accident, at a grocery store 8 months after the divorce was finalized, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee on a shelf neither of us had any reason to remember the other liked. We stood there for a moment in the strange, hollowed-out politeness that exists between people who once knew everything about each other and now know nothing current at all. She looked older, not in years exactly, but in the way people look older after a plan has failed them publicly. Some brightness gone out of her that I remembered from the early years, from the truck outside Pittsburgh, from 22 years of a marriage I still, in quiet moments, missed the good parts of, even now. "You look well," she said, which was, I think, the kindest thing either of us had said to the other since that February. "So do you," I told her, and meant it, mostly. We didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. Not anymore. Not after everything that had already been said in a ballroom full of candlelight and 40 witnesses. I paid for my coffee and drove home to the small house I'd bought outside town, closer to the warehouse, close enough that I could walk to work on the good mornings. And I thought, as I often did during that first year alone, about my father, sitting in that cramped office in 1997, telling me that a business needs 1 name on the door, not because you don't trust the people you love, but because love and ownership are 2 different kinds of promises. I understand now what it cost him to teach me that. The brother he lost to prove it. The family that never fully recovered. I understand, too, what it would have cost me if I hadn't listened. If I'd let Diane's 20 years of ours become the legal reality it had never technically been. If a man with an office overlooking the river had gotten to Thursday's conversation with more time than I'd given him. I don't know if I'd call what happened a victory exactly. Victory implies someone set out to win something, and I never set out to do anything except find the stapler. But I kept the company my father built. I kept my name on the 1 door that mattered, and I learned, in the end, in a kitchen on a Tuesday in February, exactly what he'd been trying to tell me all along, 26 years before I finally understood it.